Now, what's it? An overview of contract law. So contract law deals with, among other things, it's basically about the formation and keeping of promises. Okay, and so just some general definitions. What is a promise? We all know what a promise is, right? It's assurance that you're going to do something or you're not going to do something. The promise or is the person who's making the promise. Yeah, hold on a second. Where the project the project topics are located in the module. There's a separate module that's for a semester project. Okay. Sorry, that was a question to the whole group. So promisor is the person who makes a promise. A promisee is the person who is basically to whom the promise is made. Promisor, promisee. And so, every time I go into the chat, there we go. So what is contract law? Contract law kind of, it shows the extent to which society is allows people to make enforceable commitments that are legally binding. Okay, we'll get to the definition of a contract here in a minute. And contract law also demonstrates what excuses are, what defenses there are that are valid that would enable someone to break a contract, break a promise, or certain types of contracts. And then it also indicates which types of contracts are contrary to public policy that are going to be, for one reason or another, that are going to be treated as either valid, invalid, or void, or actually valid, invalid, or voidable. Sorry, background noise. And so that is essentially what contract law does. Okay? And so what are the sources of contracts law? By and large, as we've discussed in this course, we are a common law system, right? That came from England, came to the States, and it is essentially court-made law. People come to court with a dispute. The court reviews, the judge hears the case, the jury, whatever it is, and they adjudicate it. They make a decision, they render a decision. That decision is if appealed, usually, it can become precedent, which is case law. And that's the common law, right? Just in review. And so typically the common law in the United States is the governing body of law that governs contracts. So most of the cases most of the rules that I'm going to show you as we go forward, I'll oftentimes cite a case that gave the formation for this particular rule. Later, the common law has been codified, replaced by statutes, right? Every state has their own statutes, as we've discussed. For the purpose of this course, because the book is not California-centric, it's not based on California law, we're going to follow what's called the UCC typically. The UCC, is as you see, is the Uniform Commercial Code. And by and large, it is a standardized set of rules related to commerce, business, contracts, things like that. Why? Because interstate commerce is so darn important, right? If you have interstate commerce, which is national in scope, right? You're dealing with goods and services that are crossing state lines. You want to have some sort of uniform body of law in place that the contracts that are dealing with this interstate commerce can apply, right? So everyone kind of knows what it is. It's like if you're dealing in interstate commerce and you're crossing 4 state lines while you're taking the products from the manufacturer to the distributor, let's just say, there are 4 different states to which the goods that are in transit may have to apply, right? And so in order to alleviate those sorts of inconsistencies, right? Because every state, their laws, typically they say, oh, well, we base it on the UCC, but there are nuances. There are nuances between the states. And so that is the Uniform Commercial Code. And then obviously they're governed also by or regulated by administrative agency regulations. So common law governs contracts relating to a variety of different things, right? Goods and services, real estate, real property. We're going to touch on real property here in the course. Some of my examples relate more to real property, simply because it's easy. And believe it or not, a lot of businesses deal with real property all the time because they're in a facility, they're in a commercial unit, they either rent it or they own it. And so real estate comes into play quite frequently. Obviously, in business law, employment matters are very important, as are insurance. So those are the main areas where the common law governs contracts, specifically related to this course. Okay, and then the UCC governs contracts relating to the sale of goods, especially those that are in interstate commerce, and then leases of goods. And leases of goods, we call those chattel leases or chattel, um, chattel leases, chattel mortgages too. Believe it or not. Chattel mortgages is if, like for the example here I gave, is farm and manufacturing equipment. If you're leasing it, and some businesses just lease their equipment, that's a chattel lease, right? But if a lot of times, you know, if it's farming, they'll buy agricultural tractors and things like that, combines and all that, and they will mortgage those. They will have a mortgage on those, and that is called a chattel mortgage. It's kind of like a car payment, right? Same kind of thing. Just a weird name. Anyways, so what's a function of contracts law? Okay, contracts law is essentially designed to make stable and predictable the environment in which buyers and sellers agree to do things in the marketplace, right? Buyers and sellers agree to do things, and it provides a stable and predictable framework in which to do so. Okay, contracts law assures the parties to these agreements that the promises that they make are going to be enforceable, right? They're going to be enforceable by law. So it gives you an assurance that in the event that somebody who is a party to the contract breaks their agreements, their agreement, their promise, that there's some remedy. There's some remedy, right? And it could be damages. It could be injunctive relief, where we're asking the court to tell them to perform their obligations under the contract, or other things. And we'll go through those later. Okay. And then in business disputes, the contracts law are often typically they're followed to avoid future conflicts, to avoid future disputes. And so again, it creates a level of predictability and consistency and assurance, stability. Okay. And then by the other function of contracts law is by providing procedures for enforcing these private agreements. It provides an essential condition to the existence of a market economy, right? That's what we have. We have a free market economy. And people rely on these private agreements, these private contracts, to make the economy work. I mean, as we showed in the previous agreement, contracts touch or concern so many areas of society, right? I mean, just think about it in your own life, right? You have agreements for everything. Some of you have student loans. Well, guess what? There's a loan agreement related to those. Some of you are working, have jobs. If you're still in a job that you're still going to work every day, you may have an employment agreement. You may rent your home right now, and so that's subject to a lease agreement. There are agreements. There's so many agreements. There are contracts that are not written. They're verbal contracts. So like you lend your roommate $100 until the end of the month. And there's nothing written down. That's a verbal agreement. It's fully enforceable, subject to different rules, but as we'll discuss. But nevertheless, it's still fully enforceable. Okay, and so and without the legal framework that the body of contracts law provides, the parties to these contracts would be relying on the good faith and fair dealing of the other party. And as much as I want to believe that other parties always operate with good faith and fair dealing in mind, it's just not the reality all the time, right? And so we need to have the long arm of the law, as we like to put it, behind the contracts that we're entering into, just to ensure that there's some enforcement mechanisms available to us. Okay. All right. So, yeah. All right. Now, so let's go back to contracts now. What is a contract? A contract is, it's a promise or a set of promises to do or refrain from doing something. That's it. And of course, the law is going to enforce it. The law is going to enforce it. Now, if it's a contract that is illegal in nature, the substance of the contract, as we'll discuss in a minute, is illegal, that's not going to be enforceable. Okay, so that kind of contract is unenforceable. It's void. So, anyways, the key is that the law will enforce it. Okay. All right. Every contract involves at least two parties. At least two. You have the offer or as you know, same kind of concept as before. We were talking about the promisor and the promisee. Promisor is the one who makes the promise. The promisee is the one who receives the promise. Offer or, same thing, or. The offeror is the person making the promise, and the offeree is the person who is receiving the offer, right? The person to whom the offer is made. Now, so when you have to look at this contract formation is, we're going to get to formation here in a bit, but analyzing whether to what extent a contract exists is often one of the biggest hurdles. When you're trying to get the court to enforce the obligations under the contract. And so one of the first things the court does is they're going to determine whether there was the intent of the parties to enter into a contract, right? Intent is a primary. This thing's really bugging me. Can't get it out of my way today. I'll move it over here. There we go. The intent of the parties who are entering into a contract is very, very important. It's of prime importance to understanding the nature and extent of the contract that is alleged to have been formed, right? And so in contracts, though, what we do is we refer to it as the objective theory. The objective theory. And we've heard this before, right? Many times in this course. It's that reasonable person coming into play again. The courts don't look at what the subjective intent of the parties was. That's not their prime concern, right? They will consider it. They will consider it, but it's not the prime issue. The prime issue is basically the courts are going to look at the circumstances under which this contract was allegedly formed and look at it through the lens of the reasonable person. That's that third party, right? And they're going to look to see, you know, on the faces of the four corners of the document, what was intended, and so that is some of the facts that they'll look at might include what a party said when entered into a contract, not what they thought, what they said, outward manifestations of intent. Those are the key issues. How the party acted or appeared. The circumstances surrounding the transaction. They take all of those things into consideration. Okay. So what are the requirements for a valid contract? We're giving you some real general things right now. These are pretty important. Okay? There are 4 requirements that must be met before a valid contract exists. And I have all 4 listed. We're going to cover all of these in turn. To a certain degree, especially the first 3, the agreement. And what the agreement is, it's the agreement. There's an agreement to form a contract that includes the offer, the acceptance, and then there needs to be the third element, the third thing with formation. We'll cover this later, but so offer, acceptance, that forms the agreement, and then consideration. Consideration is very important. You can have an offer and an acceptance, but if you don't have an exchange of consideration, we'll get deeper into what consideration is in a moment, just giving you the general terms and concepts. Consideration is that thing that the parties essentially are exchanging, right? And it is, and as I mentioned, it's a promise made by the parties to the contract. It's must be supported by legally sufficient and bargained for consideration. It is something that you are giving up, right? If you're agreeing to buy something, for example, I'm agreeing to buy somebody's bike. So I'm agreeing to buy that bike and not another bike, and I'm agreeing to pay something of value in exchange for the bike. And the person who's selling the bike is giving up the bike in exchange for the money, whatever it might be, of value that I'm exchanging for it. So we're both getting something and we're both giving up something. That's consideration. Okay. And then the third requirement is that the parties who are entering into the contract must have the legal capacity to do so. For example, as we'll find out, people who are who have dementia, for example, they lack legal capacity to enter into contracts most of the time. There could be a time when they have what we call a lucid moment, and all they're under the throes of dementia 90% of the time, and then at one moment all of a sudden they came out of the fog of dementia and they were clear. They had all of their faculties in their control. That's called a lucid moment. They're very difficult to prove. The other element of contractual capacity is, were they intoxicated? Were they of the age of majority, meaning were they over the age of 18, or were they a child? Because as we'll find out, children have very limited rights when it comes to contracting. So contractual capacity is very important. And then finally, legality. Obviously, the subject matter of the contract must be legal, right? If you enter somebody enters into a contract to import a lot of illegal drugs, let's just say, for lack of a better example, I guess, they would have a hard time taking that to court to enforce it should there be a breach. But there definitely would be some sort of street justice. I imagine that would be handed out. You can't go to court for that one because of the illegality of the subject matter. Okay, and those would never be in writing anyway, I imagine. All right, so what are the types of contracts? Contracts are typically categorized, right? Again, I mentioned at the outset, there are a lot of different categories and things that we're going to be talking about. So contracts are categorized based on certain legal distinctions, right? We're going to look at them in terms of formation. We're going to look at them in terms of acceptance and performance, and lumping those two things together. Because sometimes a contract can be accepted. An offer can be accepted only through performance in certain instances, performing whatever act was requested through the offer. And so, and then you have the enforceability or the validity of contracts. We're going to kind of go through them based on each of those categories going forward. And here's a thing, diagram that I got from the book. That's actually pretty good. I couldn't do it myself. I would be able to draw that up, although I did have to edit this a little bit. Contract formation, just basic categories. They have them in the book categorized a little bit, kind of like how I have it. Bilateral, unilateral, formal or informal. I don't really go through that today. But then I do talk about express, implied, and then quasi contracts. Okay. So let's go through some of the types of contracts categorized by formation, right? And so, I'm having an issue today with this. There we go. So contracts are typically described as express, implied, or quasi. Okay. The first two are contracts. The third is not a quasi, is not a, technically it's not a contract. It is something that's created by the court, by operation of law, by the court, to remedy. It's kind of a remedy, right? To remedy a wrong. The court will say, well, there really is no contract here, but because there's some injustice or some inequity occurring, we're going to act as though a contract exists. That's called a quasi-contract. I'll give you some examples of those. So an express contract is a contract that is clear, right? It is formed by specific language, and it could be either written or unwritten. Okay, written or unwritten. You know, in the example, it would be, you know, your roommate John. You agree to lend your roommate John $100 until the end of the month, and John agrees to pay you back with interest. And so it could be in writing, or it could be just plain verbal. And if in either way, that's a valid contract. Okay. And so then you have implied in fact contracts, and these are contracts that are based on the actions of the parties rather than something that's verbal or express. Okay, it's so like the example that I give here. A person sits in a barber's chair. So you're walking down the street, you walk in, you see a barber, you walk in, you sit down in the barber's chair, the barber puts the thing on, the gown on or whatever, and cuts your hair. So an implied contract has been formed there because it's understood that you, by walking into the barber salon and whatever, and sitting in the chair and getting your hair cut, it's implied that you are agreeing to pay the barber for his or her services rent in cutting your hair, okay, based on the board rate or whatever it is. So that's an implied contract. Okay. Any questions so far, group? That's background noise. It's like Grand Central Station in my house right now. Can you hear that? That was the cat. The cat does not like being out in the hallway. All right. Anyways, so what are quasi contracts? Again, I mentioned this earlier. Quasi contracts they're not contracts, but more they are remedies put in place by the courts to basically provide a remedy to an unjust situation where somebody is not in a good spot. Here's an example, okay? And I want you to read this. I'm gonna give you a sec, okay? I'm gonna let you read this. I'm gonna come back on the other side, talk about it while I deal with what's going on with my kitty cat. So Teresa's brother, Eric, tries to talk her into building a greenhouse in her backyard, right? She's like, nah, I don't need a greenhouse. Okay. But what he says, he's convinced that if he were to build her a greenhouse, right, she would like it. And so knowing that she makes good money and she can end up paying him for whatever services he's doing later, he decides, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to surprise her and I'm going to build her this greenhouse, right? So he contacts his greenhouse builder, John. He says, hey, John, I need you to come to Teresa's house and build her a greenhouse. Teresa's gone at work during the day. John comes over. He's like, right on. And he builds the greenhouse, okay? Teresa comes home from work and there's a greenhouse. Lo and behold, she's like, wait a minute. And so Eric has asked John, who built the greenhouse, he says, hey, just send Teresa the bill, okay? So Teresa gets the bill for this greenhouse that she really didn't want in the first place, but her brother Eric had arranged with John to build the greenhouse, but she was at work, right? She comes home, there's a greenhouse, and now John, the guy who built the greenhouse, because Eric asked him to, gives her a bill. She's like, wait a minute. So now she doesn't, she's like, I don't want to pay for this. Why do I have to pay for this? There's no agreement between us. So in this situation, right? So now it comes down to, okay, she has this greenhouse, really nice greenhouse. John relied on Eric's promise that he would get paid if he built this greenhouse. He builds a greenhouse, and now John's not getting paid. So the question is, there's no contract between Teresa and John. So this is a situation where an equitable remedy would need to be put in place, right? Where the court would have to jump in and say, okay, well, what are we going to do here? Because if we let Teresa keep this greenhouse, she hasn't paid for it, right? And she didn't even want it in the first place. We understand that. But now she has it, and it's a lovely greenhouse. And who knows, tomorrow she might love it. But in any event, the greenhouse is adding to the value and desirability of the property, right? And so John would file suit against Teresa, and it wouldn't be breach of contract against Teresa. It shouldn't be, at least, because there's no contract. But John would file a lawsuit against Teresa seeking a remedy, seeking reimbursement for the greenhouse based on a theory of unjust enrichment. Okay. And so the court would kind of have to look at it and go, well, wow, all right, let's balance the two things. And so in this instance, right, there's no contract between the two, right? As I pointed out, the court might allow John to recover costs, just costs. He will not, typically they will not reimburse labor. It's just hard costs, material costs. And so that's what the court might do, right? The court is, as I mentioned, the court's likely to create what we call the quasi contract, to put a fake quasi contract in place to ensure that the parties are at least kind of, they're not necessarily going to be made whole. John's not going to be made whole in a sense that he's not really going to get paid for his labor and things like that, but at least he's going to recover hard costs, materials, and labor that he paid out. If he brought a helper along and he paid that helper, he would be able to recover for that. Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of it in a general hypo. I know it's kind of an interesting concept. All right. You understand that now? Is that better?
Yeah, I do actually. Thank you.
Okay. So now let's talk about contracts. Looking at contracts from the next, we looked at them from the formation angle. Now we're going to look at them from the acceptance angle. Okay. So bilateral contracts, right? Bilateral, or it's exchange for an exchange. Exchange of a promise for an exchange for a promise. I promise to sell my bike. You promise to buy my bike. Okay. And so that's called a bilateral contract. Most contracts are bilateral. So an example here is, or another example, Sydney promises to sell Blackacre to Bertram for $6,000. Blackacre must not have any, Blackacre must be out in the mountains or something. There's no houses on Blackacre. You find an acre for $6,000, it's somewhere in the mountains or in the desert. Bertram promises to purchase Blackacre at that price. That's bilateral. Offer to sell, offer to buy. Okay. Now, unilateral contracts, on the other hand, there's one offer made, and that's it. And the acceptance is manifested or shown through performance. And so, in traditional unilateral contract, is one in which the offeror requests performance of another rather than a promise. Okay. And so once the act is completed, the example here I'm going to give is, and this one's okay. Once the act is completed on the offer E side, right, then the contract is formed. So here in the example, Susan promises to pay Charles $5 if he will deliver a textbook to Rick. Charles is not obligated to deliver the book, but if he does in fact deliver it to Rick, then Susan is obligated to pay him $5. Okay, so it's basically an open-ended offer. She's offering it to, well, in this instance, she's not offering it to anybody. She is offering it to Charles. But she says, "Hey, you deliver that textbook to Rick, I'll pay you $5." And if he doesn't deliver it, then the book doesn't get delivered, and she doesn't owe anybody $5, right? But if he grabs the book, delivers it as requested, comes back, says done, she owes him $5. Okay, at that point, a contract has been formed. The moment he performs the act that was requested, the delivery of the textbook to Rick. Okay, clear? God, my other work phone is blowing up. So let's go on then. Option contracts. These are interesting in that an option contract, it's an enforceable promise that limits the offeror's power to revoke the offer. It's a situation in which the offeror, the person who's making the offer, agrees to hold open the offer for a specific period of time. Okay, specific period of time. There are some rules that come into play with these options, though, in order to make them enforceable. Okay, and this is the main one right here. The offer itself must be supported by independent consideration. What I mean by that is not it's the holding open of the offer. The holding open of the offer must be supported by independent consideration. And so what happens is you see these in options to purchase. Options to purchase that it'll be something like, okay, I agree to sell Blackacre to you, and I agree to hold the offer open for 90 days in exchange for $1,000. Okay, so I agree to sell Blackacre to you and hold that offer open for 90 days in exchange for whatever, $1,000. The $1,000 is supporting the part of the offer where you are agreeing to hold it open, meaning you will not sell it to someone else. You will hold that offer open for their acceptance for 90 days. That needs to be supported by independent consideration. And the independent consideration is the one, whatever, $1,000, $1,000, whatever it is, even $10. If that's what is agreed. If you, however, say, I agree to sell Blackacre to you, John, and I will hold open the offer for 90 days, period. At that point, there's an offer to sell Blackacre, but that offer does not need to be held open for 90 days, right? Because it's not supported by independent consideration. Okay, that part. And so that's kind of where it gets a little it's interesting. But those are options. And as a general rule, the offer E must give up something of value in exchange for keeping that option or the offer open. Okay, so you're holding an option, and that option is to buy it, or to accept that offer, rather, to accept the offer when you feel like it, when circumstances are right to do so. And so, okay, the offer is said to be exercised when the offeree accepts the offer in accordance with the terms of the original option contract. And so in the previous little hypo example, agreeing to sell Blackacre to John and holding that offer open for 90 days in exchange for $1,000. Say, at day 80, John says, yep, I agree, and I'm buying Blackacre. And so that is when the option is exercised. That's when the option is exercised. And then the deal is consummated. Okay? Any questions? Okay. All right. Now, keep track of that. The modern view, as I mentioned earlier, most contracts now are bilateral, but not unilateral. Most of them that we see are bilateral. Okay. And again, it's a promise for a promise, right? And so how acceptance, so how do we accept a contract? So looking at acceptance, right? Under the what we call the UCC, Article 2, it's the restatement second of contracts within the UCC. It is all offers are indifferent. They can be accepted by promising or beginning performance. Okay, and so there are certain circumstances where, you know, before you can form, especially in commerce, where before they formally accept it, they might begin performing on the contract. And so I have an example here. So Acme Company, excuse me, orders specifically manufactured goods from Barnes Manufacturing. Recognizing the speed with which the orders must be filled, Barnes Manufacturing begins to manufacture the ordered items shortly after the order is received. So the order is received, they have not yet, maybe at least formally accepted it, but they get the order and they go, all right, get going. We've got to start manufacturing these specialty products or whatever. That's an example where Barnes Manufacturing has accepted the offer, the order from Acme based on beginning their commencement of performance, manufacturing of the products. Okay. So again, this constitutes an acceptance of the offer if Barnes gives Acme notice of its beginning of performance within a reasonable time, and it completes that it creates an implied promise on the part of Barnes to complete the manufacturing. Okay. All right. Now, am I going too fast? We're good. We're covering a lot of material. So again, following up on that, right? Actually, try to get my clicker going again. There we go. So again, following up on the concept that most contracts that we see now are bilateral. There are some circumstances in which they're limited. There are unilateral contracts. Unilateral contracts are typically only found in some certain circumstances, right? A traditional unilateral contract occurs where the offeror clearly indicates that complete performance of the act that is requested in the offer is the only manner of acceptance, right? In this instance, the offeror is the ultimate master of the offer and may create the offer in this fashion. In an example that I gave is, I will pay $500. I should have written it, but I didn't have space. I would have preferred to have written it this way. I will pay $500 to the first person who paints my car. And so, because here, the way I wrote it is simply because I didn't have space. Somebody can come up and paint the car, and then somebody else could come up and paint the car, and then another person can come up and paint the car. If you have 3 people painting my car, and I'd owe $500 to all of them, technically. So, anyways, that is an offer. That's an example of a situation where a unilateral contract exists, and it's defined by complete performance is the only way that you're going to get paid, or I'm going to be obligated to pay somebody, is if they paint my car. And so the second instance is where there's an offer that's made to the public, and these are typically rewards. Okay, we live in an era where there are a lot of coyotes and things like that because we're kind of near Mission Trails and the San Diego River, and so lots of coyotes. And so we see these things all the time, you know, just people posting it on a tree or a telephone pole or something. that there's a reward for their missing dog or cat or whatever. And so that is a unilateral contract, and it's a unilateral offer that becomes a contract when someone brings back the dog or someone brings back the cat or whatever it might be. Okay. So let's talk about contracts, going through some other categories. We're going to categorize them by validity. So contracts, as I mentioned, they're valid, invalid. Well, they're valid, void, or voidable. Typically, those three: void, valid, void, voidable. And so, valid contract is one that is good. It's has legal content. The subject matter is legal, and on that basis, it is good and it is binding and fully enforceable. Then there's something called a void contract, right? That is one that is without, it's void, meaning it cannot be enforced. It's as if it didn't even exist. And that is a situation in which where the subject matter is illegal, And the example is an agreement to commit a crime. It cannot be enforced by either party. Now, it could be street enforced. There are other ways to enforce it other than going to court, unfortunately, as we find out. Then there's a voidable contract. And these are contracts that, in a general sense, they have the offer, the acceptance, the consideration. Sort of in terms of the formalities, they're all there, but there's some defense. There's some defense to the formation and enforcement of that contract that renders it voidable. And the typical example is we're missing capacity. So one or both of the parties lacks the legal capacity to understand the nature and consequences of the contract, and on that basis, the contract is voidable. It may be voidable. They have to elect to void it, though. They have to elect to avoid it. And so those are the general categories. And then also there's unenforceable. Unenforceable contract is the fourth category, actually, validity. And this one it's a contract that's valid, but there are some other defenses to the enforcement of the contract. And statute of frauds is something that I've mentioned. Statute of frauds is in the UCC, and it requires that certain contracts must be in writing in order to be enforceable. And for example, a contract for the sale of goods with a value in excess of $500 must be in writing under the UCC, under the Commercial Code, in order for it to be enforceable. And so, and these are goods in trade. This doesn't necessarily mean if you agree to sell a stereo to your neighbor or your roommate for $700, and you just do it on a handshake, that it's not enforceable. Yeah, that's a good, but it's not a good in trade. So it's not a commercial transaction. So the UCC doesn't apply. But as between businesses, let's just say, in commerce, if the statute of frauds has not been complied with, then that would be a defense of formation. Another one is the statute of limitations, right? Statute of limitations for a written contract is 4 years from the date of breach. Okay, so, and we'll cover this a little bit more in detail, but I'm just giving you the general rules. So basically, if there's a written contract to do something, I'm going to borrow $1,000 for you, and I'm going to pay you $100 per month. It's in writing. And on month 2, they stop paying. So at that point, they're in breach. Okay, they failed to perform as required under the contract. Okay, so you have the person who's aggrieved, who's not the non-breaching party, would have 4 years from the date of that breach to file a lawsuit. 4 years if it's in writing. Now, if that agreement was verbal, not in writing, they'd only have 2 years. Okay, so those are how we render an otherwise valid contract unenforceable due to some sort of problem. Okay, and then we have illusory contracts. Illusory contracts are, contracts that on their face appear to be valid and enforceable, but they're written in such a way that one or both of the parties really is not obligated to do anything. And so because of that, there cannot be a meeting of the minds. And a meeting of the minds, as we'll find out, mutual assent is what it's called. We'll discuss that later. You must have that when you are creating a contract. There must be a meeting of the minds. And so in this instance, like I mentioned, one party, just by the way the contract is written, is not really obligated to do anything. And so here's an example. Whenever a subjective condition is placed on a contingency in a contract, like I will sell my home to you if I find suitable replacement housing, okay? If anything, that's not a present intent to sell the home, period, right? If anything, you could argue that this is, it's a promise to do something in the future. But nevertheless, because of that, a subjective condition, I will sell my home to you if I find suitable replacement housing. The word suitable there creates a subjective condition on your intent to sell the property, right? Because the replacement housing must be suitable, and it's within my discretion and solely my discretion as to whether or not the replacement housing is suitable, right? And so you may never find suitable replacement housing, that whoever this person is. And so on that basis, there's no present intent to be bound by the terms of the offer. And you have to have that. And so in this instance, that would be illusory. Yeah, whatever. It's a promise to do nothing. Perhaps in the future, sell the property. Oh, okay. It's not worth anything. And so here's another example. And I any of us who are in real estate, probably at one point or another have seen offers that come in, and it says, Acme Company, comma, or assigns offer to purchase the property located at whatever. And I see them periodically with some of my clients, and we have to strike that, because what that means is Acme Company in that hypo is making it basically Acme Company or its assigns is making, or really when they say or assigns, it's actually incorrect. It should be or assignees, because they are the ones who would be assigning. This is how I always see it. I never see or assignees. And so Acme Company could get out of the contract by just saying, "Oh, we assigned our rights off to Beltram Company or whatever." And so that is a patently illusory contract. Typically, when these offers come in, it's just sloppy. They I know what they intend, and we have to clarify it. They intend to assign the interest, the ownership, or the contract rights to an entity that they're forming that will eventually take ownership of the property. And so there's a different way that we handle that. We don't do it that way. But when you see it this way in an offer, it creates an illusory contract. So you have to deal with it up front. And then a third example is Acme Company promises to buy from Batcher Incorporated, quote, such ice cream as I may wish to order from Batcher Incorporated. This is problematic because, Acme is free to purchase ice cream from any manufacturer, and it may purchase a lot from Batcher, or it may produce none. And so that's an illusory. It's an illusory contract. It wouldn't be enforceable. Okay. And then you got the standard inspection contingencies and residential purchase. These are contingency agreements such as these are valid. They are not considered illusory because, and this is based on on common law that has litigated these issues, because people have raised these questions before. Because a lot of times the way that these inspection contingencies and purchase agreements, if you go to buy a home, for example, you'll have the right to do an inspection, physical inspection. And your offer to purchase the home is contingent upon you removing, or you basically on your inspection of the property, that it satisfies whatever you need, your requirements. Okay, it satisfies your levels of value and desirability, the condition, the look, the feel, everything about the property is satisfactory based on your inspection. That's subjective. That's a subjective standard. And you can go in and just for whatever reason say, I don't like it, change my mind. And you can, that at that point, that contingency has not been cleared. Your inspection contingency has not been cleared. You can get out of the contract on that basis. And that's purely subjective. You know, many people argue that, wait a minute, that's illusory, right? Because you're really not promising to do anything, because it's because your satisfaction as the condition of the premises is purely subjective. And so the courts have ruled that because of the personal impact that buying a home has, we have to take into consideration, at least in those things, the contingencies, the subjective intent, the subjective view, the subjective intent of the parties. Okay, so it's kind of a little carve out there. And again, I will buy the home if the condition is satisfactory, and then I explain a little bit about kind of what I just said. The court is more likely to impose a standard of good faith and reasonableness. That's true. And it's the objective reasonable person standard to contingencies that require one party's subjective satisfaction rather than render the entire contract unenforceable. So they could go back and they could say, well, wait a minute. Were you acting in good faith when you went and you conducted your physical inspection of the property? And, you know, were you acting in good faith when you said the condition of the property is not satisfactory to you, the buyer? Yeah, that's what they're going to look at. But as a practical matter, you can use any reason on the planet. You don't even have to give them a reason when you are doing a physical inspection. If the contingency is still in place, you go in. Hey, if you just don't like the feel of the house, cancel. You're out. You know, I mean, some people do. Some people get really weird heebie-jeebie feelings when they go into some houses, and I can't put my finger on it. Sometimes that happens. Everything else might look great until you get in there and you do an inspection. You go, whoa, something's weird about this house. It's got bad juju. I'm sure you've all felt like weird feelings sometimes when you go into a situation. It doesn't feel right here. I always say, follow your gut. So when litigating the contract, I'm going to wrap up here at 58 minutes. This is the last slide in the morning, because this leads into what we're going to talk about on Thursday. So when a lawsuit is filed and the parties come into court and they're seeking the court to intervene in a breach of contract situation where they're seeking damages, the court is always going to look to see whether or not there was a contract, right? They're going to ask these three basic questions. Was there mutual assent? And that's what I mentioned earlier this morning when I was talking about meeting of the minds. Was there a meeting of the minds? That's manifested by, was there an offer and was there an acceptance, right? And then was there consideration? Was there an exchange of valuable consideration to support that contract? Were both parties giving up something? And are there any defenses to the formation? And the defenses could be a number of the things that we've already talked about. Did the parties have legal capacity to understand the nature and consequences of the contract that they were entering? Right? Did they have mental incapacities, or were they minors? Those are two. The other is the contract void, right? Is the subject matter of the contract legal? So there's a ton of different defenses, and we're going to cover those. Those are actually in the next chapter. And so in this book, is it 11 or 12? I can't remember. And so we'll cover those. But that's where we're going to end it today, group.